Welcome to this online lesson looking at the Anglo-Saxon rebellions of 1068 to 71. We'll be investigating the causes, events and outcomes of the rebellions early in William's reign. We'll be looking at three main rebellions. One concerning Edwin and Morcar in 1068, a rebellion involving Edgar Aethling in the north in 1069, and William's response to this, the harrying of the north. We'll conclude by looking at the rebellion of Hereward the Wake. But first we're going to consider William's use of castles. Firstly, read this source. The fortifications that the Normans called castles were scarcely known in England, and so the English, in spite of their courage and love of fighting, could only put up a weak resistance to their enemies. This is a source written by Odoric Vitalis, who's a crucial source at this time when there were so few historians. Odoric Vitalis had an English mother and a Norman father, so potentially quite a balanced view. He wrote this in his book Historia Ecclesiastica between 1123 and 1131. So this was a few years after the period that he was studying, but just about within living memory. Your tasks then. What do we learn from this source? Why is Odoric Vitalis a useful source of information? And what might make us question the accuracy of what Odoric Vitalis has written? Pause the video now and consider those questions. Okay, so what we learn from this is that the castles were really effective against the English. Because they were a new military strategy and technology, the English really had no response to them, and so they worked. Odoric Vitalis might be quite a useful source for us because he was writing quite near the time of the event, but also had quite a balanced view of both the Normans and the English, having both an English mother and a Norman father. I imagine his feelings towards the matter were often quite complex. What might make us question it though? Well, when we consider that the Battle of Hastings was, well, let's do the maths quickly, a good 60 years before this. This is a little bit like someone recalling the events of something like the Korean War or maybe the early stages of the Vietnam War today. Indeed, Odoric Vitalis likely wasn't alive when these events happened, and so he would have been working on other sources and hearing things passed down. The three main rebellions then. We will consider three major rebellions that William faced early in the conquest of England. The Revolt of Edwin and Morcar in 1068, Edgar Aethling and the rebellions in the north of 1069, and Hereward the Wake and the rebellion at Ely in 1070 and 71. About halfway through, we'll also consider one very crucial example of William's response to these rebellions with the harrying of the north. The Revolt of Edwin and Morcar is our first rebellion. You might want to add this as a subheading. What you need to do is create a table with the headings causes and consequences. Then you need to record these facts under the correct headings. Explain three causes and three consequences of the revolt, and then as an extension, what do these events tell us about William's style of rule, particularly towards the Saxon nobility. Press pause now, and then when ready you can press play and we'll continue. Okay, let's have a look through these causes and consequences. William went back on a promise to let Edwin marry one of his daughters, which would have given Edwin power. Of course, that's a cause because it upset Edwin. William hurried north and built castles in Warwick and Nottingham, which were Edward's lands, and York, which was Morcar's lands. That's a consequence of what happened. Morcar was replaced as Earl of Northumbria despite allowing him to keep his title. That's also a consequence. William did not trust Morcar to help defend the north against invasions from Danes or Scots. That's more of a cause because it helps explain why William treated him as he did. Edwin and Morcar had been shown off like conquered prisoners when William visited Normandy in triumph in 1067. That's a cause. Edwin and Morcar were proud and they didn't like being humiliated. William had not kept his promise to Edwin, which suggests that he did not trust William to keep his promise to allow him to continue as Earl. That's a cause. William allowed his men to destroy or harry wherever they came, destroying crops and housing as a warning not to rebel against William. That's a consequence. Edwin and Morcar realised that they did not have the power that they had expected when allowed to keep their earldoms. That is a cause. So what does it tell us about William's style of rule? Well, it shows us that he's quite willing to promise one thing and then act in a completely different way, as long as it keeps himself more powerful than his earls. So really, he's a much more powerful king than Edward the Confessor was. He doesn't work with his earls, he instead tells them what to do. We're now going to have a look at the second rebellion, Edgar Aethling and the rebellions in the north, 1069. We're going to create a sort of mind map or structured piece of note-taking. In the middle it will say causes of the 1069 rebellions, and you'll need sections with a decent amount of space on each of the following. Resentment at Norman takeover. Resentment is where someone is very deeply upset about something and kind of holds a grudge about it. Edgar Aethling and his ambitions to be King of England. Fear of losing land to the Normans. And finally, Anglo-Saxon rebels thought that Danes and Scots would help them rebel. What you need to do first is create a piece of structured note-taking in whatever way suits you, whether it's a mind map or a piece of paper divided up as you see here, and be ready to take some notes that will appear on the next screen. So create your note structure first of all and press play when you're ready to see the info. Here's our first page of information. Pause this at any time that you want to review it. If the text seems blurry, make sure that you're playing this in high definition. Rebellion 1, early 1069. In the north, William wanted to assert his power and transfer land ownership to Normans. The Norman leader, Robert Cummin, was not welcome as people hated the idea of having a Norman in charge. Saxons attacked his army at Durham. Many Normans were killed in the streets, we think around 900. Robert Cummin himself was burned alive. As a result of this, the northern Saxons rose up and surrounded York. They were joined by Edgar Aethling, who came back to England from Scotland to lead them. William acted with great speed and savagery. He harried the countryside, built a second castle in York, and sent Edgar running back to Scotland. Thinking his work was done, William returned back south. Okay, pause the video now and make some notes under the appropriate headings on your structured note format, whatever you decided to do earlier. Pause the video now. So here's some basics of what you might have come up with. Resentment over Norman takeover. William had been asserting Norman authority and building castles in the north, and William was sending his own nobles north like Robert Cummin. Edgar Aethling hoped to be king. Edgar decided to take advantage of the chaos by joining the rebellion, with hopes the rebellion would spread. Fear of losing land to the Normans. William had begun the process of enforcing the transfer of land ownership in the north. Saxon landowners lost out. And lastly, Anglo-Saxon rebels thought Danes and Scots would help them rebel. Edgar had come back to England from Scotland. Okay, there's more to this though, because William had just headed home and now it was time for yet another rebellion. So, what happened in the summer and autumn of 1069? A large Danish invasion fleet started raiding the coast, led by the King of Denmark and his sons. Edgar Aethling, leading the English rebels in the north, seized control of the city of York. Attacks on Normandy by local rivals in France provided an extra distraction for William, and rebellions in the southwest and on the Welsh border further stretched William's forces. Lastly, there was an invasion by King Malcolm of Scotland into the north of Northumbria. Your tasks then. Add more to your diagram. Then as an extension, what made this rebellion so dangerous to William? Pause the video now while you add to your notes. Okay, let's see what sort of ideas we've got here. Well, one reason why this is such a dangerous rebellion is because it stretches William so far. If he has to deal with rebellions in Normandy itself, in the southwest of England and on the Welsh border, on the Scots border and around Yorkshire, then his forces are going to be stretched incredibly thin. Luckily for him, basically all of these other rebellions were also defeated. So here's some other notes you might have added. Resentment over Norman takeover. William had to contend with other rebellions, not just in the north, but in the southwest, on the Welsh border, the Welsh Marches, and in Normandy itself. Edgar Aethling hoped to be king. Edgar seized York, and William's castle was burnt down. Fear of losing land to the Normans. Much of the rebelliousness William faced was because of Norman land takeovers across the country, not just in the north. And Anglo-Saxon rebels thought that the Danes and the Scots would help. Well, that's understandable. Malcolm of Scotland invaded Northumbria in support of Edgar. The King of Denmark raided the coast with an army including his sons. So what did William do about this? Surely he was losing patience now. Rebellion 2, autumn-summer 1069. How did William respond? Well, firstly, he marched his army north and at a pace into York. The English fled and the Danes stayed on their ships rather than fight. They realised that they were really up against it. William celebrated Christmas in York, wearing his crown with a big ceremony, showing that he had the power. And lastly, he ruthlessly destroyed the opposition. showing great leadership, but also a certain amount of, let's face it, evil brutality. Your tasks then. Describe how William put down the rebellion. Explain why these tactics were likely to succeed. And thirdly, in your view, was William now more powerful than he had been before? Explain your point of view. Pause the video while you complete those tasks. Alright then, so hopefully we've got a summary as to how William put down the rebellion, both by harrying and burning down the countryside, and giving visible signs of his power, like marching his troops in and staying in York for the anniversary of his coronation, and wearing his crown. So why were these tactics so likely to succeed? Well, part of them show that William is a really powerful military commander, which means that any potential rebels would be kind of terrified to take him on. Another example is that he's publicly showing how powerful he is and that he's the King of England who intends to stay. But lastly, he's showing great ruthlessness. This would have been a deterrent for anyone else who wanted to show a rebellious streak in the future. We're now going to have a look at what William's response was in terms of something called the harrying of the North. We get some brief clues and hints as to how devastating this was from the Domesday Book. There will be a separate lesson on the Domesday Book soon. Example number 1 looks at the village of Cleaton in North Yorkshire. Have a read of this. No? Alright, I'll give you a bit of a help. You might be able to see Cleaton at the start. It's highlighted in red. There you go. These cross-throughs are not mistakes, that's the Norman version of highlighting. You'll probably recognise this name as well. That means that actually Cleaton was originally held by Harold before 1066. It says how many plough lands he had. It looks like he had 28, and it looks like there was a small holding there, and various other things too. The Domesday Book is quite useful for finding out how valuable places were. The bit that's really interesting for us in terms of understanding William's response is the very last bit. We see that Drogo is now in command. Drogo was a famous Norman knight, and quite a brutal one. And we see this last section here. TRE. That means Tempus Regnus Edwardus. In other words, in the time of King Edward, the settlement was valued at £30. It looks like it might be £32. It's a little bit blurred. Put it this way, £32 was a serious amount of money to be taken from a small settlement per year in taxation. But look at the very last line. Now it is worth £6. £6 instead of £30. So where has the other 4/5 of the wealth of that settlement gone? Surely, if William is only collecting £6 in taxation instead of £32, he's missing out. What's happened? Now we see the entry for Pickering. We can see the name of it there. Pickering's in North Yorkshire. It's about a day's ride away from York. A reasonably important settlement, William built a castle there during the harrying of the North. We also see that Morcar had a manor there, or at least he did before 1066. At the end we see a whole list of other villages, places like Middleton and Barton. And at the end of the list it says Città Vasta. Well, what does this mean? Well, quite simply, it means they are laid waste. William appears to have completely destroyed all of these settlements. So what effect has that had on his finances? Well, here's this phrase again. TRE, Tempus Regnus Edwardus, in the days of King Edward. The settlement was worth £8. Now it is worth 20 shillings, or £1. Again, the wealth of the area has been completely destroyed, and surely it looks like William is the one who's missing out here. So what on earth has he done? Well, the simple answer is he's committed the greatest act of brutality of his entire reign. The harrying of the North. Add this as a subheading. Following the rebellions of 1069 and 70, William was determined to set an example. He devised a plan, which was called the harrying of the North. What does this source suggest William's tactics would be? Why did he do this in this way? And might William be justified in his actions? Answer those questions before we move on, so pause the video now. Well, this source is from the Bayeux Tapestry, which was made in the 11th century and mostly concerns the events surrounding the Battle of Hastings. However, it shows a house being burnt down. You can see a mother and child running away from the burning building as the Normans torch the place. In fact, we can see at the top in the text, Hic domus incenditur, here a house is burnt. This tells us that William was not at all afraid to damage civilian property, terrorise civilians and even kill them if it meant he got his way. So why did he do this? Well, he wanted to set an example and punish the people of the north, who had not once but twice shown rebelliousness to his rule. He didn't want to be overstretched again with rebellions in Normandy and in the West Country and on the Welsh border and in the north, so he wanted to set an example for all to take notice of and to ensure that the north, which was of course more remote than the other places, would never rise up again. So might he be justified in these actions? Well, it certainly helped secure his reign, but when you look at the consequences of what he did, he couldn't really justify it, and even William on his deathbed likely regretted it. Consider these sources, and I will warn you there's some pretty nasty stuff in them. The first is from our friend Odoric Vitalis again, an Anglo-Norman writing in the 12th century. The king stopped at nothing to hunt down his enemies. He killed many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. To his shame, he made no effort to control his fury, and he punished the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food should be burned to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of hunger. I have often praised William, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him. Those are pretty strong words. Bearing in mind that Odoric Vitalis was writing during the time of William's kind of grandson and grandchildren being on the throne. So, why did Odoric Vitalis write this? Well, it's likely that as an Anglo-Norman, he had some sympathy for the people who suffered up there and couldn't really find any defence for what William did. To put it in perspective, 100,000 people back then is a huge proportion of the population of the country. This is a true war crime, even if we take into account that there's likely to be some exaggeration in such an old source. How about this one? This is from another English monk writing in the 12th century. People were so hungry that they ate human flesh as well as horses, cats and dogs. It was horrific to see human corpses decaying in the houses and roads, and there was a terrible smell because there was no one alive to bury them. For 9 years no one lived in the villages between York and Durham. That's a huge area. Durham is about 60 miles away from York. So if you imagine the number of villages there would have been in there, if they were all deserted and all laid waste, this is a colossal, horrendous loss of life. Consider as well how hungry the people must have been if they really did resort to eating horses, cats, dogs and even each other. Truly dreadful. Your tasks then. Read the sources. Describe what happened during the harrying of the North. Then describe the interpretation or opinion of the harrying of the North given by the Norman Odoric Vitalis. Do you think that Odoric Vitalis' interpretation or opinion of the harrying of the North is biased or one-sided? Explain your answer with reasons. Pause the video while you complete that. Okay, let's consider this. Hopefully you've noted down some of the horrors that people experienced during the harrying of the North and the destruction they suffered at the hands of William's troops. What is Odoric Vitalis' interpretation? Well, quite simply, he believes that the harrying of the North is an act of great evil, and that this is ultimately a crime that William will one day have to be punished for and have to account for, but probably at the hands of God. He was too powerful while alive for anyone else to punish him. So is Odoric Vitalis' interpretation biased? I tend to think not. If Odoric Vitalis is being this critical of William, and yet in the same paragraph saying that he has often praised him, we can see that he's actually being quite even-handed here. He has praised William where he sees that he deserves it, and here he is condemning him in what are actually very strong terms for a piece of history at the time. Remember, most of the history written at this time was written to please the reigning regime. This bit was just there to record a tragedy. What was the impact of the harrying of the North? You're going to see some examples in a moment. Explain the likely impact of each example on the north of England. Then as an extension you could identify which effects are social, so to do with having an effect on people, and which are political, having an effect on power. Vast areas of land were destroyed and the population was in huge distress. This included refugees and starving people, as well as just those who were killed and struggled living where they did. Many areas did not recover for a long time. Parts of Yorkshire were still derelict in 1087 according to the Domesday Book. Consider that, that's as many as 17 years after the event. And they're still seta vasta. That was the term that was used in the documents we looked at earlier. They were laid waste. Many people died and there was a famine due to the destruction of the countryside. Remember that William ploughed salt into the ground so that nothing could grow, as well as burning down people's farms, destroying their tools, and also killing their herds. This broke the English will to resist, ensuring Mercia and Northumbria never revolted again. Farms, land and villages were left deserted, and refugees searched for new homes, and many went as far as the southwest. Okay, pause the video here and complete the tasks. So hopefully you've been able to identify what the effects are, and basically this is economic and human devastation of the whole of the north of England. It really did set them back for generations. We're now going to have a look at this from the point of view of an exam style question. Explain how William the Conqueror responded to the rebellions of 1069 to 70, a 12-mark answer. You may use the following in your answer: castles, the destruction of livestock, and you must also use information of your own. If you don't want to have a go at answering this question now and you want to skip straight ahead to Hereward the Wake's rebellion, then that will be in a couple of minutes' time. Just have a look on the seek bar. However, if you do want to answer this, here's some tips of how to do it. You'll need to fully explain 3 examples. Use point, example, explain and link to help if you need to. Here's how you might structure it. Make a point about what happened, give a specific example of what happened, explain what this meant, and then link this back to the question by explaining how this was a response to the rebellions. Then you need to conclude. Explain the most important example or the overall theme. If you want to have a go at answering this question, you should spend between 12 and 15 minutes on it. Pause the video now if you're going to have a try. Okay, something to bear in mind. The marks attached to this one are 12 marks in total, with 6 marks for knowledge and 6 marks for your analysis and your interpretation of the importance. Let's have a look at an example answer and see how those marks can be picked up. What I've done here is I've colour-coded the point, example, explain and link in different colours to pick them out. One way that William responded to the rebellions was by building castles. For example, after his castle at York had been destroyed by rebels in 1069, William ordered a second to be built. Castles were used to provide a secure base for William's troops. This was a response to the rebellions because William could use the troops to deal with the rebellions. But also castles were an intimidating presence and a symbol of his power which would help prevent future rebellions. Notice that last paragraph really strongly links it back to this theme of William's response to the rebellions of 1069 to 70. Another response was William's harrying of the north. In the harrying of the north, William burnt down villages between York and Durham and killed thousands of people. William also ensured that there would be long-term effects. Livestock were killed and salt was ploughed into the land to prevent crops from being grown, leading to a deadly famine. This was a response to the rebellions as William wanted to punish those that he saw as rebels and set a terrifying example to others to prevent them from rebelling. Again, a clear link back to this idea of William's response to the rebellions. A final response was William's decision to spend Christmas 1069 in York. William decided to stay in the north after the rebellions as a public show of strength. This showed that he was unafraid of further rebellions and wanted to show the people of the north that he was not only in charge, but he was present in the north. This was a response to the rebellions as William wanted to publicly show how powerful he was and that he was nearby and able to react quickly to renewed rebelliousness. Now the conclusion. The overall theme of the response was terror. William's use of castles, harrying the land and remaining in the north are all ways that he was terrifying the English. Even William accepted that he had treated the English harshly on his deathbed. This was an effective response to the rebellion as there were no further significant rebellions in the north of England. Okay, it's time to have a look at the next rebellion now, which as it happens doesn't take place in the north. Rebellion number 3. Hereward the Wake and the rebellion at Ely in 1070 and 71. I've included a map that shows the rough location of Ely within the county of Cambridgeshire, and also an image that shows the local landscape. What do we notice about it? Well, it's pretty wet and it's very flat. This is an area called the Fens, and that becomes important when we understand how the rebellion proceeds. The Isle of Ely. Today it is many miles inland in Cambridgeshire, but then it was a large island surrounded by water and marshland, so really difficult to attack. Indeed, Ely means the Isle of the Eels, because there were lots of eels that were caught there for food. What's the relevance of this? Well, this island became a centre for a number of English rebels, but the man that emerged as their leader was Hereward. But he could never win the support as King of England. So why did he rebel at all? Well, all of this is down to revenge. Hereward, and that's probably not his real name, means guardian of the army. Hera being an old English word for army, and ward as in to ward against something. I've included a link in the description to a video which recaps some of the early rebellions that we've already looked at, but also considers the rebellion of Hereward the Wake. I suggest that you watch this before you proceed. When you have done so, press play on this video again, and we'll continue. So hopefully you've seen the video now. If not, we'll try and give you the main details. Create a table of Hereward's actions and William's responses. Record the information on the next screen under these relevant headings, which are Hereward's actions and which are William's responses. Explain why Ely was difficult to conquer. What role did the Danes play in this revolt? And finally, why was William so effective in his response to this revolt? Pause the video now so you can note down these questions, and then you'll be able to complete the tasks more easily as we consider them on the next screen. Okay, let's have a look. The Danish again brought a fleet to England threatening an invasion. Hereward, a local thane, led an attack on Peterborough Abbey and with his Danish allies stole the abbey's treasure of gold, silver and jewelled ornaments. Remember, Hereward was acting very much in revenge for the killing of his brothers by local Normans. Hereward took these items back to Ely with his allies and held the island for over a year. William's men could not overcome the problem of the marshland and the water defence. Therefore, the rebels attracted much more support, increasing their threat. Morcar, this is the same Morcar from the rebellion of 1068 and the Battle of Gate Fulford, Morcar even joined the rebels, and it was easy for exiles to travel to Ely by sea. William needed to deal with the rebellion himself, so he sent messages to King Sweyn of Denmark offering him money to go home. In this case, the bribery worked. The Danes sailed home with their riches. After all, they were only in it to get rich. William surrounded the island and ordered his men to build a causeway onto the island. A causeway is a sort of long bridge. They used wood, stones and trees to create a bridge, but when his knights attempted to cross, it collapsed and many of his knights drowned, unable to swim in their heavy armour. A second bridge was made using boats and wooden planks. This was successful, and when William entered, he had people's hands and feet cut off, eyeballs pulled out, and imprisoned some of them for life. A typically brutal response. I've missed out the bit about the witch in the tower. I mean, it's funny, but it's not really relevant here, so let's just leave that. If you don't know what I'm on about with the witch, you clearly didn't watch the video, so you're lost. Alright, pause the video now and complete the tasks from the previous screen. Pause now. Okay, ready to move on? Well, hopefully we can see that Hereward's actions are largely at the start. It shows how he gathers strength, how he gathers allies, and what actions he takes to make the rebellion last so long, particularly in terms of choosing a good defensible location on the island of Ely. In terms of William's responses then, we can see that his responses are largely military, but also political. By bribing the King of Denmark to leave, and succeeding, he made his task that much easier because he wouldn't need to face two armies, but only the one. He was also prepared to invest time in this. The engineering challenge of building the causeway and then later being guided there just shows what a good commander he was in terms of both bribing the locals, bribing his former enemies, and indeed commanding his men to do his bidding. There should be by now no surprise in the fact that the rebellions failed, but let's remind ourselves why. Firstly, there was no strong alternative to be the King of England. Edgar Aethling was never really a powerful contender. The leadership of the rebellions was poor. Probably Hereward was the most charismatic leader, but even he failed. The rebellions were not coordinated and lacked support. At this time, these sorts of campaigns could only take place during the summer months when the weather was good enough typically, and therefore there tended to be one rebellion a year rather than 3 happening all at the same time, which may have overwhelmed William. Also, the Danes had their own motives and plans. Remember that they failed to support the rebellions of 1068 and 1069, and when they saw William's armies marching to contest them, they simply left. Also, they accepted William's bribery in Hereward's rebellion. Lastly, William's actions and leadership were often decisive and also often evilly brutal. So your tasks. Which causes do you think are the most important for the failure of these rebellions? List them from 1 to 5, with 1 being the most important. Then think about each reason for failure in turn. Explain in more detail how you think each cause may help explain the failures, referring to examples that we have studied so far. Pause the video while you do that, but once you have completed that, it'll be the end of the lesson. I'll say thank you very much for watching and taking part, and if it's been useful, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much, and goodbye.